Welcome to the Alaska Weather Show. I'm meteorologist Peter Chan, coming to you from the National Weather Service. We try to do this each evening through a unique partnership with Alaska Public Media. It is Thursday, November 10th, 2022. And I have a lot of things to talk about this evening. If you would like additional weather information, you can always go to weather.gov. That is the National Weather Service's presence online. And it'll bring you a map of the continental U.S. with Alaska and Hawaii in the lower left. It is an interactive point-and-click map. So when you point on the map, it'll give you a forecast and any relevant watches, warnings, or advisories, along with much other information to search for on that site. This Thursday afternoon of note, we've had Hurricane Nicole come on shore into Florida. It has weakened to a tropical storm and will continue to further weaken as it lifts across the northern part of the state up into Georgia overnight. In the northern plains, the Dakotas, and northwest Minnesota, a blizzard warning remains in effect. And ahead of that system, it was incredibly warm today across areas of southeast Wisconsin, lower Michigan, and Illinois. 76 degrees, a record high temperature for November 10th in the Chicago area. Quite remarkable. Temperatures hit 70 degrees as far north as Mackinac City, if you're familiar there with the Great Lakes. Well, here is the map showing what is left there, Tropical Storm Nicole. Nicole is the first November hurricane to strike Florida since 1935, so this is definitely a rare event, and the center of that system is located now up there toward the northern part of the state. It'll lift northward across Georgia overnight tonight and into the day on Friday before weakening into a tropical depression. It came on shore in eastern Florida with maximum sustained winds near 75 miles an hour, along with some heavier rainfall. But here in Alaska, we've dealt with some heavier snow in the northern panhandle. There were winter weather advisories through mid-afternoon, and the winter storm warning for the Haines area expired just around airtime now at 6 p.m. this Thursday evening. 7 to 11 inches of snow has been reported around Haines with this system, 5 to 7 inches in Gustavus and around Hoonah, as well as within the Mendenhall Valley and around Juneau. But as I mentioned, the snows there in the northern panhandle are in the process of winding down through the late afternoon and early evening hours. Another thing, Anchorage Forecast Office has had reports of ice jams on some of the creeks and smaller rivers going up the Susitna valleys, as well as the Anchorage area. And we expect, because we had such cold temperatures last week, this time up through the weekend, it allowed a fair amount of ice to build up on some of the smaller rivers and creeks. And now that we're seeing temperatures near and tad above freezing, it's causing that ice to break up and create some ice jams with some minor flooding along these areas. So that will continue as a possibility here as we go through the weekend. We actually have a push of milder air that could bring some rain and temperatures well above freezing to the Anchorage area here as we get into the latter half of the weekend. Gale force low and occluded front is working its way through the Aleutians, and that front will push up across the Alaska Peninsula as we go through tonight and tomorrow. And that system will gradually weaken, but it's going to induce a secondary low that's going to send a surge of moisture up along the western into the northern Gulf. And yet, on top of that, there will be another compact low lift out of the North Pacific into the western Gulf as we head into Sunday. So this is going to bring a round of heavier rainfall. 4 to 6 inches of rain could fall from Friday through Sunday up there towards Seward, Whittier, and Cordova. And as this system will be a wet one there along the Gulf, it's also going to pull in a little milder air, so we don't have the cold air in place to create the snows like we had in south central areas here this past week. Further west, there could be an enhancement to some of the snow along areas of the west, especially the lower up to the middle Yukon Valley as we go through Saturday into Saturday night, as that system does spread some other moisture a little further back up through the west. But taking a look at some FAA webcams this mid-afternoon on Thursday, Pedersen Hill there at Juneau, some light snow and fog, 34. Haines showing snow and fog, 27 degrees. But as I mentioned, by airtime now, the snow will be diminishing across much of the region, at least the significant accumulating snows. And with the occluded front working its way up through the Alaska Peninsula, Falls Pass ahead of it has seen wind-driven rain, some gale force wind gust, a temperature of 42 degrees. And temperatures west of there and through the eastern Aleutians around Dutch Harbor will peak up in the mid and upper 40s today. That will be some of the warmest temperatures in the state, and that milder air will tend to want to ride up along the Pacific side of the Alaska Peninsula into the western Gulf as we go into Friday night and Saturday. AKwx in the southwest interior continues to see some patchy light snow and fog and a temperature of 26 degrees, and we are seeing some areas of patchy light fog and snow continuing in areas of the central interior, including Fairbanks. But looking at the various hazards, warnings, watches, and advisories, the winter storm warning for the Haines area will be allowed to expire right at the airtime of this broadcast at 6 p.m. this Thursday evening. And I included the special weather statement for the Anchorage Valley as well as the Mat-Su Valley for the potential for those ice jams to continue going into the early weekend as we see temperatures near and rising a bit more above freezing as we get a little push of warmer air coming up at Cook Inlet. That'll keep that threat of some ice jams and some minor flooding along some of these small streams going for the next at least couple of days. Satellite imagery shows a good healthy push of moisture in through the northern Panhandle area, and that's lifting north up into northwestern Canada. Meanwhile, very clear circulation around that low, centered south of Adak early this morning, and as it works its way eastward, the low at one time had storm force winds. Now we're seeing gale force winds around this low, and the occluded front pushing out in through the lower portion of the Alaska Peninsula there towards Sandpoint, back around St. Paul. In fact, St. Paul this afternoon reported winds gusting as high as 60 miles an hour, along with some blowing sand around the sand dunes there. So it's a windy system, but it will continue to gradually weaken as it works its way eastward. On the weather map, a couple of lows there in through the Gulf, enhancing the precipitation, but as I mentioned, the heavier snow is winding down now across the northern Panhandle. Still a pretty strong low, 963 low located there near the central Aleutians. Weak high in the central interior with some patchy light snow flurries around it. And still a weak area low pressure will persist along the northwest coast with a trough of low pressure along the northwest and Arctic coast, just keeping some patchy light snow and fog going up there as well. Later tonight into early on Friday morning, we still have a weak low off of the Panhandle in the northeastern Gulf, and then that low that is working its way through the eastern Aleutian will continue to slowly weaken with the occluded front pushing further up across the Alaska Peninsula. By Friday afternoon, we'll see some better rains there across Kodiak Island, pushing up along the east side of the Seward Peninsula, and the low will kind of split with a secondary low. And as we go into Saturday afternoon, that system will weaken, but still push some pretty good rains there, say around Seward on up and surrounding areas of Prince William Sound. There could be locally heavier snow in the coastal mountains around Prince William Sound, eastward toward Cordova, and even just west of Yakutat. The interior could see some light snow enhancing there along the Yukon Valley and the west side of the state as we get some additional moisture spreading up northeastward in that area. Low temperatures Friday morning will generally be near freezing there in the northern Panhandle, above freezing in the south. Still below freezing anticipated there, Anchorage Bowl, south central interior, though 40s return on the outer Panhandle and southern areas of the Panhandle. Notice the warmer temperatures creeping up along the western Gulf, 47 there at Kodiak, and Saturday morning lows will be creeping upward there across south central areas and staying well above freezing east side of the Seward Peninsula and immediately around Prince William Sound. Temperatures could be around or even a bit above 40 in Anchorage by Saturday afternoon, so that could cause the ice to further break up on some of the rivers and creeks there in the Mat-Su Valley. Back through the Panhandle, expect highs low to maybe mid-40s. Coldest temperatures Friday morning, east side of the Brooks Range, Yukon Flats down toward Northway, 0 to 5 below, teens many places elsewhere. And then Friday afternoon highs stay coldest there in the northeastern interior, but otherwise 20s as you go up the Yukon Valley, generally mid-20s across the Seward Peninsula. Saturday morning lows, single digits above and below 0 there across the Arctic coast and down through the Brooks Range, Yukon Flats, Alcan border. And Saturday afternoon highs generally getting back up teens in the north, 20s south of the Yukon River and back through the Seward Peninsula. Warmest temperatures Friday morning. We see that milder air creeping up the Alaska Peninsula. Friday afternoon could see temperatures upper 40s some areas from the eastern Aleutians up through portions of the central Alaska Peninsula up toward Kodiak. Still near freezing there at Bethel, AKwx, and then Saturday morning temperatures continue to moderate and best chance of seeing some some readings at or a bit above 40, south end of the Alaska Range, and especially along the western Gulf. And looking at the extended temperature outlook, November 16th through the 20th, we expect across the mainland temperatures to be milder, average above normal. It still could average a little below normal there in the southern panhandle. And what's going to happen over the central continental U.S., much below normal temperatures, colder winter-like temperatures anticipated across areas of the plains, especially the northern central plains, western Great Lakes. And precipitation is expected to average a little above normal in the northern portions of the mainland, November 16th through the 20th, with the best chance of below normal precipitation parts of the southeast interior and especially the southern half of the panhandle. And that would be, again, November 16th through the 20th.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Well, let's take a look at your aviation weather. And if you have a flight planned Friday or on Saturday, the main weather feature, we have a low pressure currently working its way along and just south of the central eastern Aleutians. This feature will weaken. A secondary low will develop and then track northeastward up through the western Gulf, Kodiak Island, toward Cook Inlet as we go into Saturday. And yet later on in the weekend, we expect compact low to lift out of the North Pacific right up again toward that area. Kodiak Island into Cook Inlet, and that will have a tendency to may have a little milder air with it. Meanwhile, in the far north, trough of low pressure lingers along the northwest and central eastern Arctic coast, with a weak low kind of riding along that feature eastward through the course of the weekend. IFR conditions, rather extensive areas of Bristol Bay down through the Alaska Peninsula and eastern Aleutians, as well as centered on northwestern Gulf around Prince William Sound, and a pocket of IFR up through the east central Yukon Valley, Yukon Flats. For Friday afternoon, IFR conditions rather extensive across areas of the western Gulf from Prince William Sound down through east side of the Kenai Peninsula, Kodiak Island, areas of the southwest and through the Kuskokwim and lower Yukon valleys, and still some areas of IFR inner channels there, inner coastal mountains of the Panhandle. For Saturday morning, IFR conditions become more extensive across the Gulf, continue there along areas of the inner coastal mountains and channels of the Panhandle, and extending up into the Yukon Valley in the southwest interior. And Saturday afternoon, we look for that moisture to expand northward up to the Brooks Range into the central north slope. Widespread IFR across the southwest, northern portion of the Alaska Peninsula, lower Bering, and then back out across the Gulf Coast there in through the northern Gulf and Panhandle. Pass conditions Friday for Anatuvik Pass as well as Adigan Pass. We expect MVFR conditions there in through the Brooks Range. Lake Clark and Merrill, general MVFR conditions expected throughout Friday. Same thing for Randy Pass as we begin to enter the central Alaska Range. Windy Pass, MVFR conditions Friday, as well as Isabel Pass as we head eastward. And Mentasta Pass may see VFR conditions develop there by midday Friday afternoon. And then further south and west, Tanita Pass generally should remain in MVFR conditions. And as we go further southwestward, Portage Pass is going to be a split. IFR conditions are expected to hold there along the east entrance, along areas of Prince William Sound, but further west, MVFR conditions will give way to VFR, especially at the west entrance. Chilkoot and White will see IFR conditions Friday morning give way to MVFR conditions as the day unfolds. Freezing levels at the surface run along the northern Bering, up into, say, Nome, and then along the southwest coast, east side of the Kenai, and up along the Gulf Coast into the inner channels there of the Panhandle, with freezing levels aloft upwards to 2,000 feet there in the northeastern Gulf, as well as north of the eastern Aleutians and the Alaska Peninsula to about St. Paul, St. George. And icing, the greatest threat for icing will be at the frontal system, secondary low developing there just southwest of Kodiak Island, with the frontal boundary extending eastward into the western Gulf, anywhere from above 4 to above 6,000 feet there, especially along the Gulf. Areas of isolated moderate icing possible over the Panhandle above 5,000 feet and extending back out toward north of the Aleutians, and generally between 2 and 8,000 feet in the Chukchi Sea, especially along the northwest coast and northern areas of the Seward Peninsula. jet stream winds aloft, we have as high as 105 knots there up into the Kenai Peninsula from the south, with a jet core to 120 knots south of the central Aleutians. At 700 millibars, 9,000 feet, we see some stronger winds coming in through areas of the Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet up into south central, with a core of winds above 65 knots south of the eastern Aleutians and the tip of the Alaska Peninsula. And then at 3,000 feet, we see the low pressure located there along the far extent, southwestern extent of the Alaska Peninsula. Winds upwards to 60 knots coming up into the entrance there of Cook Inlet with that frontal band, and south of the low, upwards of 50 to 65 knot winds out of the west-northwest south of the Alaska Peninsula. This is going to translate to turbulence. The greatest threat for isolated severe turbulence, entrance of Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay off the Kenai Peninsula, just east-northeast of Kodiak. Surface to 6,000 feet in a broad area, surface to 4,000 foot turbulence possible back through the southwest interior, and then surface to 3,000 feet in the Aleutians.
Greetings, Moon Musers. Trace here. The moon is our constant companion in the stars, which usually means it gets overlooked. So this week, let's spend a minute on the moon. Hit the darkness around 12 a.m. on Tuesday, and there will be a lunar eclipse. The further west you are, the better the view will be. Use an app to find the best time to see it. But eclipse or no, the moon is still beautiful. Try to make out the gray volcanic fields called Maria, grab binoculars, and look for the prominent craters like Tycho, surrounded by impact ejecta. The moon is the center of countless ancient and modern myths. In ancient Finland, they said the moon was the whites of an egg laid by a duck, and the stars were the fragments of the shell. Today, people believe the moon affects moods and even births, though very careful studies of millions of births disagree. It is sometimes fun to speculate. Keep looking up.
Welcome back to another edition of Alaska Weather Facts. I'm meteorologist Dave Snyder, and we have a special guest in the studio today. We welcome Amanda Terborg of the Aviation Weather Center. Thanks for joining us, Amanda.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Amanda's flown in all the way from Kansas City, and for those of you that don't know, the Aviation Weather Center serves the lower 48 for aviators, just as the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit here in Anchorage serves all of Alaska. So I kind of wonder, what's the Aviation Weather Center in Kansas City doing to help out Alaska, Amanda?
Yeah, we do a lot of collaboration work with our sister station up here. Lately, we've been doing a lot of work, especially in the satellite meteorology.
Okay.
In particular, we have been looking at ways to better identify icing conditions in clouds, which is a big deal up here because, as I'm coming to find out, even though I'm not from here, you guys have a lot of pilots here.
You have a lot of pilots. In fact, when you say you can't get there from here, that's how you get there.
Yeah.
Very good. Okay, so with icing potential then, what's Kansas City working on?
Well, we are working on something that will help us, again, identify the icing in the clouds. You don't want ice on your aircraft. No. Not only does it add a whole bunch of extra weight to your airframe when it attaches to the wings and the nose cone, but it can also mess with your aerodynamics.
Right.
And in the most serious conditions, that can mess with it enough that you can actually crash.
It changes the shape of the wing, and that makes it sometimes impossible to fly, right?
It does, yeah. So we want to figure out a way to better forecast for that.
Makes sense.
Now, this particular image is over Alaska. The colors here are a little goofy. It doesn't look like your run-of-the-mill satellite image.
Okay.
But the red is where you have liquid clouds and the blue is ice. But again, it really doesn't tell you a lot where you have icing conditions in that cloud. Because in those clouds, there's little droplets, and they're cold, and they're actually below freezing, but they're still liquid, and that makes them sticky. Okay. So when an aircraft flies through there, those droplets are sticking to the aircraft, and it can happen amazingly fast.
Right.
And so that's what we're trying to find. And there is a product called the Aircraft Flight Icing Threat that does this. And it's basically looking at the temperature of the cloud, and it's also looking at the size of the droplets to identify a probability and intensity of those icing conditions.
Okay.
And if you flip to the next image, this is a case from Juneau, Alaska, where this probably wouldn't have been the best day to fly around Juneau.
Okay.
Now, there was an area of moisture that pushed south from the southwest up along the coast that pushed in a stratus layer. And in the stratus layer, there was a lot of those super cooled liquid drops, or a lot of stickiness.
Okay.
And so the flight icing threat was able to, in the pinks and the reds there, was able to identify where that icing was. Now this is really cool. It's really cool to be able to identify that there is, of course, caveats to every product. Much as we wish it would happen, the sun doesn't shine all the time, unless I guess if you live in northern Alaska during the summertime.
Right.
But we need that sun to be able to bounce off those clouds and to be able to see where those super cool drops are.
Okay, so it's a daytime only tool.
It is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Right now, of course, we're in the era of advanced satellite technology, and there is a satellite that can actually use moonlight to see clouds.
Yes.
And so sometime in the future, we hope to be able to do that.
Okay.
Another thing that is a bit of a challenge is multiple layers of clouds. You can only see so far through a thick cloud.
Okay.
And if it's thick enough, sometimes you can't see a layer of icing that's below there.
Right.
But even besides those caveats, this product has a lot of potential to help out Alaskan aviators here.
Well, it sounds like a really big deal, and something that forecasters at the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit could use probably on a daily basis, and especially in the middle of a really big storm.
Yeah, I would think so.
Do you have a really good success story in the lower 48 using this tool?
It's a fairly new product, and so we're still evaluating it. But yeah, we've had a lot of cases where we have seen that it does tend to capture those icing conditions.
Okay, very good. Well, Amanda, thanks so much for sharing some of the very interesting satellite imagery and the tools that you're using there at the Aviation Weather Center in Kansas City with us here in Alaska. People can probably find some of this information online, right?
Yeah, here is a website here. It's a page from NASA Langley, and they have this imagery as well as a bunch of other satellite imagery that you can take a look at.
Okay, great. And I'm sure our friends at the Alaska Aviation Weather Center and the unit will be using that in the coming months there with your training and your help there to learn more about that tool to help Alaska aviators any day of the year. That's wonderful stuff. So thanks again for joining us, Amanda, and we welcome you to view any of our Alaska weather facts on YouTube anytime at the address below, and we'll see you next time.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Well, it's now time to conclude our show with the marine weather segment and looking at the sea ice edge today. There's a fair amount of ice now that has developed across the Arctic coast. We're still seeing some shoreline ice developing there along areas of the northwest coast down south of Point Hope in through Kotzebue Sound, as well as in areas of Norton Sound, but ice development will continue. We're also seeing some ice, early season ice there along the YK deltas. And the ice that we had out in areas of Cook Inlet have kind of slowed. In fact, we may see milder temperatures that could be creeping upward into above 40 degrees here as we go through this weekend, especially latter half of next week. So ice development in Cook Inlet may really be impeded. But for areas of the Panhandle for Friday, winds interchannel south-southeast, Ketchikan through Petersburg, 15 knots, waves 3 feet. Northwest winds 20 knots, 3-foot waves there in Lynn Canal. And then the outer coast winds westerly 15 knots south of Sitka, waves running about 9 feet. Southeasterly there west of Gustavus through Yakutat with waves of 8 or 9 feet. On Saturday, another frontal band approaches. We could see southeast winds 20 knots, gust upwards to 35 knots, inner channels around Petersburg with waves of 3 to 4 feet. Outer coast, generally south winds 30 knots south of Sitka, but from areas west of Gustava on up through off of Yakutat and Cordova, 35 to 40 knot gales, waves building upwards of 16 to near 20 feet. For the northwestern Gulf, strongest winds Friday will be there at the entrance of Cook Inlet, 45 knot southeast to east winds with waves of 15 to 20 feet. East winds Prince William Sound to 25 knots, waves 6 feet, and upper Cook Inlet, northeast winds to 20 knots and waves 4 to 5 feet. On Saturday, winds are generally going to have a southerly component out over the open waters of the Gulf to 30 knots, waves running around 15, 17 feet. Look for southeast winds to 30 knots in Prince William Sound, waves 6 feet. And Cook Inlet winds east-southeast 25 to 30 knots, waves 5 to 8 feet. On Friday, across the Alaska Peninsula and especially south of Kodiak Island, southeasterly gales of 35 to 40 knots on the Gulf side with waves of 15 to 17 feet, trailing off to 25 knots there south of Sand Point. Bristol Bay, easterly winds to 40 knots, waves 9 feet, but trailing off to 25 knots from the east, and 8-foot waves north of Cold Bay. On Sunday, winds will generally be out of the south-southwest across the region, Ocean. On the North Pacific side to 30 knots with waves running 19 to 22 feet. And on the Bering side, south to southwest winds to 20 knots and waves 7 to 10 feet. Across the Aleutians, strongest winds will be on the North Pacific side, westerly gales of 40 to 45 knots, highest waves south of Dutch Harbor 25 feet. But on the Bering side, winds will turn westerly to 30 knots with waves running 10 to 13 feet. And then on Saturday, winds will generally be out of the west-northwest at 20 to 25 knots, waves running 12 to 14 feet on the North Pacific side and around 10 to 12 feet on the Bering side, especially across the central and eastern Aleutians. For the southwest coast, strongest winds east-northeast offshore 35 to 40 knots around St. Matthew down through St. Paul and St. George, waves running 12 to 15 feet. North winds there through Norton Sound with waves of 3 feet. Then on Saturday, look for northerly winds at 30 to 35 knots south of St. Lawrence, west of Nunavik Island, and in the vicinity of St. Paul and St. George with waves running 10 to 14 feet, though as high as 17 feet in the vicinity of St. Matthew. North winds Norton Sound and waves 5 feet. Across the Arctic coast on Friday with ice in place, we are looking at south winds 10 knots. Winds turn east to northeast and then turn back into Kotzebue Sound north and westerly at 25 to 30 knots. Waves 5 to 7 feet lower Chukchi Sea, 7 feet north side of St. Lawrence Island. For Saturday, easterly winds 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast, though again, ice generally in place east of Utqiagvik. And then look for winds northerly 25 to 30 knots through the lower Chukchi Sea, 5 to 6 foot waves, and north winds on the north side of St. Lawrence Island to 30 knots with waves running 10 feet. And that wraps up the show for this evening. Thank you for watching, and join me again tomorrow.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.